So have you ever asked yourself what makes a news story? Because we've got different types of content online that serve very different purposes. But what makes something get covered in the news? So there's 6 different aspects that make a story newsworthy. If you can hit all 6, then you've landed a jackpot. However, having 2 or 3 of these in your story is more than enough to get it covered. So they're going to be timeliness, proximity, impact, novelty, conflict, and human interest. So quite simply, timeliness is when a story is relevant to something that is happening or is going to happen. Proximity just means it's in your local area, close to you, distance-wise. So your local news tend to cover that. Impact, so a lot of political stories might not be super interesting to read, but they have a ton of impact on the entire country. So they tend to get covered. Novelty, so a new survey or a new study or a new research paper tends to give a new light on existing knowledge. So that tends to get covered. Conflict is always an interesting one. Unfortunately, most of the news tends to be negative. So if you have a story that has some form of negative light, you're able to get into the news slightly easier. And finally, human interest. So any form of human-based story where someone is being vulnerable or talking about their own experience tied in with any of the other ones tends to add a layer of relatability to any story and makes it a lot more likely that it gets covered. The easiest way to implement some of these into your story is to start off with a couple of different ideas that you like and asking yourself the simple question of, so what? So if your pharmacy just launched a vaccine service and you want to talk about that in the news, that's not really relevant. So you have to ask yourself, so what? If you tie it into data about how people that get the flu at a specific time before winter are more likely to not get a cold, that makes it newsworthy. If you talk about a subset of people who didn't get it last year and how the flu spiked last year because of it, makes it more newsworthy. If you get a case study of someone who is quite ill and they talk about how the flu jab more or less saved their life, that makes it a news story. So always ask yourself, so what? And try to ask it as many times as possible to give your story as many interesting angles as possible, because sometimes one headline doesn't work, so you need to repivot and push through another headline. But if your story only has one angle, it becomes a bit harder for you to pitch it because you're only relying on one story. So one of the best ways to learn how to make a good story is to learn from all of the campaigns that have failed. And I've worked on hundreds of campaigns, and there's a bunch of really common reasons that a campaign will fail. The first one that is only interesting to you. It's about your business, it's about your expert, and offers nothing insightful or relevant to anyone else. Journalists are not going to cover that. Like any other branch of entertainment, they are KPI'd on views. And they want as many people to read your story as possible. So if there's not going to be a lot of people reading it, they're not going to cover it. Another one that a lot of people fall into is the finding is just obvious. Saying that you should wear a coat because winter is coming is incredibly obvious. But saying that this specific type of coat is incredibly light and fits in your bag solves an actual problem that people might face when carrying around a coat. So make sure that your findings aren't obvious. And if your story is obvious, either try to make it interesting or cut it altogether. Your story might just be too niche to scale. And that might be okay. You might be trying to get into a very specific trades publication and it really works for them. But I like to think of story ideas that appeal to as many people as possible. And if one of the angles is very niche, then that's perfect. I have different types of ways to pitch one story to different types of people. So if there's a very specific developer issue with the new iPhone software that you want to pitch to a very specific group, you can do that. But if that impacts a wide number of people, you can also pitch that angle to national publications. Another reason stories fail is it's already been done. If you are the third person to talk about changing your tires in the winter, it is very unlikely that it's going to get covered. So you need to either be early, find a unique perspective, or cut the story altogether. The last one, which is very common with business owners who are new to PR, is that it reads like an ad. Your story has to be that, a story, something that is interesting, that is tied to your brand, but not about your brand. So if you're trying to run an advertorial, they have sections for that. But if you want journalists to cover it, it has to read like a story. And one of the easiest ways to find really newsy stories is to consume the news. And there's no tool better out there than Break the Web at allowing you to consume what people are actually talking about. So you can go to the tool and you can find your niche from the top left. And let's say you work for a client who's interested in sports. You can go and find every interesting story around the news, and then you can even directly speak to it. And then if you have an athletics work client, you have a bunch of different stories that you can talk about, and you can find even niche stories by doing what about specifically shoes. And then it'll give you a ton of different stories and ideas that you can run with. And you can also just consume the news, click on any one of them, and find what people are speaking about, and then all the related stories to it. So you can do your research in a lot less time and know what's happening in the news every single day without necessarily going and looking at 100 publications every day. But it's one thing finding a story, and it's another thing actually running a newsjacking campaign, which is what we cover in this video.